Hello, everyone. Tony Costa here from Toronto Apologetics. So glad that you could join us. I'd like to encourage you, if you've not done so already, to subscribe to the channel, Toronto Apologetics, 100% free. And all you have to do is just go down to the bottom of the video, click the subscribe button, and you will be joined to our channel. I also want to ask if you could like the video and also to share it with your friends. Now, you're probably noticing in some of my videos, I've had my little sheep here behind me, and that is the one sheep out of the 199 sheep were safe, but the one little sheep was lost and it was found. And I've been asking a number of my viewers for a name for um, my little sheep. And so the name that we have finally decided on is Lamb Chop. Lamb Chop. You probably remember that kids' TV show with the lady with the Muppet, the sheep Muppet. And so my our good friend Anne Martinez, and this is a shout out to you, Anne, for that name. So she suggested that name, and we fell in love with it. And so our little sheep now is called Lamb Chop. Now, you'll notice there's another stuffy here as well, and there's a little stuffy in front of lamb chop, and that is a whale. And maybe I'll just turn it a bit here. You can see the dorsal fin there in the back, but that is supposed to be a whale, and you could see the eyes on either end here. You'll see the eyes there looking at you, and that that stuffy was made by um, a young girl in our church. Her mom told us that she loves to crochet, and so I just want to do a shout out to my good friend Elia. Elia, and thank you again for making that for us, for myself and my wife. We really appreciate that. So just a lovely thing. So the next thing on the agenda, folks, is now we've got the name for our lamb. What would you call our whale here? And I don't think we'd call it Jonah because Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, or as the King James Version says, a whale, a great sea creature. So yeah, send us your thoughts in the comment section. What you think we should name our whale? So um, that's that again. We've already got lamb chop, so we just need a name for the whale. Well, today on this particular segment of this video, I wanted to talk about the earliest. What is the earliest source document we have for the New Testament? And um, if someone were to say, "Well, do you have anything tangible, anything that we can touch? What is the earliest documentary evidence that is written down for the New Testament? What is the oldest copy we have of the New Testament text?" And so the oldest copy that we have, or the oldest fragment that we have of the New Testament, is right here. Now, this is not, of course, the original fragment. This is a exact replica of the fragment that I'm going to be talking about, and this is known as Papyrus 52, P52. And this little fragment here, when it was discovered, and let me just say that first and foremost, this is extremely valuable in terms of New Testament textual criticism. This little parchment, I'll say more about it. This little parchment measures about 9 centimeters by 6 centimeters, approximately. That would be approximately 3.5 inches by 2.25 inches, something like that. 3.5 inches by 2.25 or 2.5 inches. And it is really the size of your credit card when you look at it. Now, this fragment, the original, this is just a replica, a very good replica, by the way. And the original of P52 is housed in the John Rylands University Library in Manchester, UK. And so the first thing we need to be aware of is that if you want to see the original of this document, you would have to go to England, up into Manchester, and you could actually see it there, housed there. Now, this little fragment was um, purchased in 1920, so a little bit of history here. It was purchased in 1920 by Bernard Grenfell, who was on the Egyptian antiquities market. So someone who was involved in archaeology, Egyptian antiquities. So it was purchased, as far as we know, in 1920, but it was basically stashed away, and it wasn't really discovered until 14 years later in 1934. And at that time, it was then translated by C.H. Roberts. Now, three of the leading papyrologists. Now, a papyrologist is someone who um, is an expert whose expertise is in papyri or papyrus single, papyri plural. So what you see here, folks, this is a papyri or papyrus. It's a single part of a single sheet, a fragment of papyri. And these three leading papyrologists, um, whom C.H. Roberts sent, he sent photos of this fragment. They dated it from about 100 AD to 125 AD, some going as far as 150 AD. And so they would place it in the beginning of the second century up until the quarter or the half mark of the second century. And so P52, as it's been known, it's been cataloged as Papyrus 52. That's what the P stands for. Um, it contains parts of the Gospel of John. So this is a fragment from the Gospel of John, and it contains John verses 31 to 33, and it also contains John 18 verses 37 to 38. Why do I say that? Because when you flip it over, there's writing on the other side. And so there was writing on both sides of this papyrus. And so here you have what's called the this here would be um, the recto, and then you've got the verso. Now, what does this tell us? Well, the fact that there's writing on both sides of this papyrus indicates for a number of scholars that this comes from a codex. That is to say that the codex form is what we call a book today, where you get pages written on both sides and then they're bound in the middle and then you flip them over, unlike a scroll where you unroll it and then you roll it up again. So a codex um, is like a book. It's just the old Latin word that would be used to what would later we would call a book. And so for convenience sake, instead of unrolling it and rolling it, you could flip the pages. Now, that is not to say, however, that is not to say, as I'm just going to show here, if I can get my hands here. Let me see here. I'm just trying to reach out here and find a Bible. And I happen to have one right here, right under our little whale. So if you look up Revelation chapter 5, you will notice there in chapter 5 of Revelation, in verse 1, the Apostle John writes, Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with seven seals. And so in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 1, John sees in a vision God seated on the throne, and then the Lamb comes and he takes the scroll from the one who is seated on the throne. And John says that the scroll was written within and on and without. King James, I believe, says that. So, in other words, the scroll is written on both sides. Now, that's not unusual. There have been archaeological discoveries of scrolls that have been discovered that are written in the inside and the out. So, what John is describing in Revelation 5, verse 1, about a scroll being written on both sides, is consistent with what archaeologists have found in some cases with scrolls. And so the idea of a scroll being written on both sides, although it's highly unusual, it is not without evidence. So there are some cases where scrolls have been found written on both sides. So the fact that this papyrus 52 is written on both sides is suggestive, again, suggestive to most scholars that this is referring to, this comes from a codex, that is from a book form. Now, it was also discovered in Egypt. So, what I wanted to do at this point here is I want to share a chart here that was put together by my good friend Wes Huff, a fellow Canadian, a a scholar in the making, and a very dear brother in Christ. He will be on with me, incidentally. He will be on with me this coming Thursday, so July the 17th. Some of you who may be watching this video after it's been put out, of course, you can always go back to my channel and look for my interview with Wes Huff. But one of the things that I appreciate about Wes is that he has a great ability to put things up, especially when it comes to manuscripts. And Wes has done a fine job here of putting together just a fact sheet on Papyrus 52. And so what I showed you here in this replica, you could see there on the diagram, if you can see my mouse here. These are the same papyrus. Like I said, it's just one photograph from the back and the front. Okay, so there. And it's called P52. It's cataloged in the John Rylands Library as 457. Okay. And Wes makes a good point here that there's much debate about the approximate date of P52, although it has been dated as early as 100 CE or AD and as late as 300 CE AD. The consensus is that it sits somewhere within the second century. Now, why is this important? It's important because when they found this in Egypt, this was found near in Egypt. There's an area called Oxyrhynchus, and there they have found troves of scrolls and manuscripts and papyri. Perhaps it's better to say manuscripts. Let's just, for the lack of a better term, they have found a treasure trove of manuscripts there, and a lot of them in papyrus form, like P52. And so this was discovered in Egypt, and if it dates to within the second century, as I said earlier, about 100 AD to about 125 AD, 150 AD, why is this important? It's important because for the longest time, many liberal scholars were arguing that the Gospel of John was very late, and they applied the evolutionary view that you go from the simple to the more complex, and because they felt John was very different from the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they thought that John was probably written much later, that he had a very developed Christology, a very high Christology. And so the idea was that since John seems to have this very high Christology, the seven I am statements of Jesus, the seven signs, they believed that, well, this must have come later. And some of these liberal scholars placed it as late as 200 AD, that John's gospel would have been produced as late as 200 AD, which would be already past his lifetime. John is believed to have died near the end of the first century AD. And so the argument was that John was a very late gospel. It was not written by the Apostle John. It was written by someone, or they gave it the name John or try to connect it with the Apostle John. And so the argument was that the Gospel of John was very late, and they would place it around the year 200. Well, with the discovery of P52, when they discovered this little fragment, they realized, wait, we've got a time problem here, because if this fragment if P52 dates to the beginning of the second century, 100 AD, to about 125, 150 AD, and it's in Egypt, it's found in Egypt, in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, then the question is, when John wrote the gospel, the fact that it's already nearing the first century, it's edging its way towards the first century, being 100 to 125, 150 AD, if that's the date of this papyrus, then that means that this is a copy. Remember, this is a copy. This is not the original fragment that John the Apostle himself wrote with his hand. If this is a copy of the Gospel of John, a fragment, a portion of the Gospel of John, then that means that the original logically would have to predate it. If this is 100 to 125 AD, then that means the original would have had to been written in the end of the first century, middle to the end of the first century, which would place us in the time of the life of John the Apostle. Now, according to early church records and tradition, John ended up in Ephesus, what is today modern day Turkey, known as Asia Minor back in the first century. And so there's this very strong church tradition that places John the Apostle in Ephesus. And so if John went to Ephesus, and there's also there's a lot of tradition associated with John and the mother of Jesus, Mary, and the fact that John took her into his care. The belief is that Mary was with John, with his disciples and the Johannine community, as some scholars call it. And so, therefore, Mary is believed to have lived in Ephesus and died there. And of course, there's later apocryphal texts that say she died in Jerusalem, and we won't go into that. That's not the point of the video today. But the point is, if John wrote the gospel, his gospel, uh, with his own hand, his pen, if John wrote his gospel in Ephesus, which is all the way over uh, in Turkey, if he was all the way over in Turkey, um, and then he had to write um, the whole account of Jesus's life. What this would mean is, if John writes his gospel in Ephesus and the early church wants to get its hands on copying the Gospel of John. Remember, in the first century, and even afterwards, and even until the invention of the printing press, everything was copied by hand. There was no photocopying. There was no facsimiles. You couldn't fax things, and so the early Christians would write by hand. That's why they're called manuscripts. They're scripts written by the hand. And so what we find then is that if John writes his gospel, let's say there's debates about whether he wrote in the 60s and others in the 90s. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, he wrote towards the end of the first century. Then that means that people would want a copy of John's gospel. And so Christians would copy and copy and copy. So we have P66, Papyrus 66, which has the Gospel of John in it as well. Of course, not fragmentary, and more of a complete codex. But Christians would want to make copies and copies and copies. So if John writes towards the end of the first century, let's say the 90s AD, and this is discovered around 100 AD, and it dates to 100 AD by some scholars' estimation, between 100 to 125, 100 to 50. And if John writes towards the end of the 90s AD, then you're looking at something that is very close to John, a copy of a codex that chronologically speaking, is very close to the first century, to the end of the first century. Even if you were to place this into 150, and John writes at the end of the 90s, you still have a 50-year gap there. So what we're saying is that if this is a copy that is found in Egypt, and if you just think of where Turkey is and where Egypt is, they're quite apart. They're not close to each other. And so the fact that this papyrus was discovered in Egypt and John wrote in Ephesus over in Turkey, that means that not only was his gospel copied, and it would have been copied in mass, since it's the writing of an apostle. Um, the fact that it reaches Egypt and this fragment is part of a bigger codex, and it's dated to, again, 100 to 125, 100 to 150 AD, then that means that it got to Egypt. It would have had to get time to be brought to Egypt, or you would need time for a copy of John's gospel to come to Egypt so they can copy that one. So manuscripts are copies of copies of copies that all go back to an ancestor manuscript. It goes back to the original manuscript. So all that to say that after this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in 1934, this revolutionized New Testament studies, especially with the Gospel of John. In other words, the Gospel of John, instead of being put into the 200s when it was written, now this fragmentary evidence suggests that the Gospel of John actually is first century, at least late first century. And so most scholars today would admit that the Gospels, the four Gospels, are first century documents. And a lot of it had to do with the discovery of this very important papyrus. Now, let me just show you if you look at the origin. Again, West does a great job of this. It was discovered in Egypt. And if you look at if you go down here and you look at the asterisks, Egypt, and maybe even Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the speculated original location, but it could have realistically been produced anywhere in the Mediterranean at that time. The discovery, again, it was discovered. It was stashed away in the John Rylands Library in Manchester and discovered in 1934. And again, written in Greek. And if you look at it here very closely, you'll notice that you have what's called uncial lettering, that is capital letters written in Greek, and the material is papyrus. Papyrus is where we get the word paper from, and papyrus was made from the reed plants that usually grew along the Nile. And because papyrus was very fragile and brittle, that if it dried severely, if it was severely dried, it could begin to crumble. And that's why you have this. That's why you have a lot of these manuscripts, papyrus. That's why they look fragmentary. There's holes in them. They look like they're falling apart. And this doesn't just apply to the New Testament. We see with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you also have fragments from Qumran. Um, and so papyrus is not a very durable substance. It dries out and it begins to crack and break and it begins to fall apart. That's why you again notice this. This is a fragment. And that's not unusual with papyrus. And John the Apostle and the other New Testament writers wrote on papyrus. That was the writing material of the first century and before the first century into the BC era. And so that is why the originals, we don't have them. We don't have the original autographs. What we have are copies of copies of copies, from which we can reconstruct the original through the science we call textual criticism. Now, that's why they look like this. It's not because somebody didn't like it or they fed it to their dog. It's because papyrus is a very, very fragile writing material. Now, the contents, again, I've already mentioned, contains John 18, verses 31 to 33, and John 18, verses 37 to 32. If you just come up here to the top left here, there's 114 legible letters are visible on the two sides of the fragment. And if you look here, these are all Greek. These are called uncials. They're capital letters. They're all capitals. There's no capital and lowercase. They're all capitals, which is was the writing style, at least of the first, at the very least, the very first 300 years of the church's history. That's why if you look at Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, they're also written in capital letters. It's not until you get to the 800s, 900s that we begin to see what's called the minuscule. And so down here, P52 papyrus is written on both sides, which indicates that it originally came from a codex and not a scroll. The only exception I would say to Wes's note here is that they have found scrolls that have been written on both sides, and in fact with seals on them. And if you want to look at up here on the far right corner, what you see here in the outline is the fragment, of P52. That's what you see there. And it's showing you where it probably uh, came from. So you can see that the section here of P52, what we call P52 today, uh, may have come from the top left corner, as you could see it here. And so Wes makes the comment, the recto side preserves the top left corner of a right-hand page. The verso preserves the top right corner of a left-hand page. So here's the remaining text, the text that used to be part of this whole page. This part has disappeared, and the only thing that's been preserved is this side here. Wes also makes the point that text is rounded and elaborate. The style indicates the book hand of a non-professional scribe. Nonetheless, the seeming effort in how the text appears to have been written indicates an individual who is educated and writes in a careful imitation calligraphic hand. And here he makes the note, if the codex from which P52 originates contained the entire text of the Gospel of John, it would have constituted a single quire book of around 130 pages. That's 33 large folded papyrus sheets written on both sides, measuring approximately 21 by 16 centimeters when closed. This would have been as many as 576 pages in total. So that's all that's remained of this fragment is this part here. Now, to give you an idea, just to give you an idea of the text that we have here before us, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share, just so you can see where we are at here in terms of the wording in this text. I'm just going to share this page with you. And so here, what you find here at the top, what is in bold here is what you find in the Greek text. And so what you find here, so this is again the front part of the papyrus there. And what it's done here in bold letters, it's duplicating the letters that appear on the papyrus, and the non-bold letters are the ones that are missing. So again, the one in black is what we find on the front here of the papyrus. And so what you find here, here in the top, so that's what you see in the papyrus is hoi, hudeoi, hemen, that is in back down here in English, the Jews. So what you find is the word for the Jews, and then you have the personal pronoun for us. And you will see that this is the context of Pilate interrogating Jesus. And they go on to say it's not permitted us to kill anyone. And that's this part here. This is the Greek word hudena, that we are not allowed to kill anyone. And then John uses what's called the hina clause, the hina ho logos, hina ho logos to Jesu pleirothi. In other words, so that the sayings or the word of Jesus might be fulfilled. So that's the part that that is missing in the manuscript. And then you have the words here, the word for signifying here. You got the word Simeon, the word for signifying. He was signifying the kind of death that he was going to die. And so uh, here you have the word, the ending of the word for death. So that this is the word for death here. You just see in blue there. Apothini Sikain, that he was going to die, and that you see down here. And then from there, you have the word, the preposition there, that he entered, therefore, again, into the praetorium. You see the ending of the word for praetorium here. And then you have the words ho Pilatos. Now, all you have, of course, in the papyrus is the beginning of Pilate's name with the pi. And then he summons Jesus, and then you see the word kai apen, meaning and he said, which is C down here. And he said to him, he asks him the question, thou art king of the Jews. And the only part we see in the papyrus is the ending of the word Jews. Okay, this is the whole word here, the Odion for Jews. And this is the only, so we know where it's coming from. We know it's coming from John 18. And these are verses 31 to 33. Now, when you take the papyrus and when you flip it backwards, what you have in the back is the continuation of this interrogation that goes on between Jesus and Pilate. And so here he asks him the question, are you a king? And Jesus goes on to say, you say that a king I am. Um, and so you have here again, and this is what appears in the papyrus, and it's the word tuto gegeni mai, meaning for this reason I was born, or for this I have been born. And in the Gospel of John, it goes on to say, I've come into the world. And you could see that here. You could see it in the fragment. You got the word cosmon, which means world in Greek, and then hena, so that, or in order. And this is the word, the beginning of the word for to testify, marturos, marturiso. So we have this dialogue that goes on between Jesus and Pilate. And then Jesus makes this statement that I've come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth, so there it is here, everyone who is of the truth. And here you find, this is what we find in the papyrus, okay? Literally, those who are of the truth, those who are ektis, ali theos, all those who are of the truth, and then this part is missing, akue mo tis phonis, those who hear my voice, everyone who's of the truth hears my voice, and then here you have the immortal words, lege ato, and he said to him, that is Pilate, said to him. So there you have the word lege atol that appears in the fragment. And who said it? Well, we know from the Gospel of John, it's Pilate, ho Pilatos. He made this statement, and then of course he makes this amazing word, this amazing question, by the way, that does not appear in the papyrus itself, but here he says T esten aletheia. And the T here, by the way, folks, this is known as a interrogative. It's a form of asking a question. And he says to Jesus, what is truth? That's what he's asking him. What is truth? And what we have in the papyrus is, and this. You got the words "and this," as you could see down here. And then he sent them out again to the Jews. That's what you find here in the papyrus. You have tos hudeos. So we only have that definite article there, the tos hudeos. And then the remainder of it is he says to them, I find not one. That is to say, I find not one fault in him. So as you can see, folks, just by looking at the English translation, we don't have a lot because again, this is a fragmentary document. And if you look very closely, there's a lot of holes in there too. There's what we call lacunae. Lacunae means that there's these gaps. So this is not surprising. We're not surprised to see this. We're not surprised to see the fragmentary nature of P52. But why am I mentioning all this? I'm mentioning all this, folks, because this is the earliest that we have. The earliest that we have is a fragment. And if it's dating from 100 to 125, 150, I mean, you're looking at 2,000 years. And the fact that this has survived for about 2,000 years, that is quite remarkable. And the other thing we also need to understand is that this earliest fragment comes from, excuse me, the Gospel of John. Now, that's not to say that there won't be other discoveries. I mean, archaeologists and scholars and historians are always on the move to find and catalog manuscripts. We want to find the oldest manuscripts. We want to find manuscripts that are older and closer to the time of Jesus. And this little fragment, P52, brings us to the precipice of the end of the first century when John was alive. And so in all of Christianity, just think about this for a minute. In all of Christianity, this is the earliest that we have written on both sides. This is the earliest from the gospel that has received the most attacks by liberal scholars and by Muslims too, by the way. Speaking back to us, written by a brother in Christ who wrote the Gospel of John so that his church would have a copy of it. And even though we have a fuller account of the Gospel of John in Papyrus 66, P52 shows us that the Gospel of John not only was written early, at least in the end of the 90s AD, but that it was copied, just like the other texts of the New Testament, just like the other books of the New Testament. It was copied by the people of God so that we would have the Word of God in our hands today. And so this is a wonderful witness to the providence of God. It's a wonderful witness to the truth of Christianity and the fact that scholars want this and they want to keep these. And that's why they put them in museums or in libraries, because they are precious and they are testimonies from the past. Before I go, folks, I just want to mention my book, No King But Christ, The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Sect Worldviews. It's a book that deals with the place of Christians in the modern world today. And it's been received with high praise by not just the endorsers, but Christians who've been reading it, buying it and reading it. It's available on Amazon. I'll have a link to this book in the description box. And so I would encourage you to get a copy of my book, No King But Christ. I also have another book that you may be interested in. I wrote this a couple of years ago, Early Christian Creeds and Hymn, What the Earliest Christians Believed in Word and Song, and Exegetical Theological Studies. So the book, Early Christian Creeds and Hymns, I'll put a link to that in the description box as well if you'd like to get my book on early Christian creeds and hymns. And so, folks, thanks again for watching. And as I said, I will have Wes Huff with me this coming Thursday, 7:30 p.m., Thursday, July the 17th. If you're watching this already beyond the date, then you can refer to my video with Wes Huff. And we're actually going to be talking about the reliability of the New Testament in light of manuscript evidence and things like P52 and other papyri, and then looking at other codices and so on. So thanks again, everyone, for watching. I trust that this has been a blessing to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to like the video and to share it. Until next time, everyone, take care. God bless.